Okay, so this is the week, and we've been leading up to it, but this is the week when we find out how Israel came under the power of the Roman Empire. And the story that we fill in, if we don't know exactly how this happened, is probably quite a bit different from how it actually occurred, as I hinted last week. So, to start where we picked up, to pick up where we left off, Salome Alexandra is the last ruler that we looked at, and her own personality didn't really dominate her reign. Mainly, it was a time of reform, educational, religious. Her brother and the other Pharisees really directed the direction of the country and a lot of things that went on. She was more of a background ruler than somebody like her husband Alexander had been. So the real power belonged to the Pharisees during her reign. And the Sadducees, kind of a reversal of what had happened under Alexander, the Sadducees began to be persecuted, not crucified or anything like that. So not to the extent that the Pharisees had been, but still several of them were put to death during her reign. And as you can see there, Alexandra and Alexander had two sons, and these are names that we've seen before. They're new people. We haven't met them yet. But the older one was named Hyrcanus. So Hyrcanus II, after John Hyrcanus, his grandfather. And Alexandra appointed John Hyrcanus, the guy with the long beard. Right there. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. The one with the unforked beard, who looks older. He wasn't this old at this time, but she appointed him, Hyrcanus II, as high priest. Of course, being a woman herself, she couldn't be high priest, but she could be the ruler of the nation. And we don't know for sure whether John Hyrcanus II, I don't know if he is John Hyrcanus, but Hyrcanus II was a Pharisee or a Sadducee, what camp he belonged in. He probably favored the Pharisees somewhat, but he doesn't seem to have been a man of strong opinions. He wasn't really a natural leader or somebody who would promote his own ideas over the ideas of others. So Hyrcanus was also heir to the kingdom. He was high priest, and when Alexandra died, he was the one who was going to become ruler. And by reputation, he was a weak and ineffective leader. He was easily controlled. He didn't inspire a lot of respect or loyalty in those who followed him. So the second son is Aristobulus II. After Alexandra's first husband, who had been king very briefly. Aristobulus II was given no political power. He wasn't heir to anything, really, because mainly of his wildness and hot temper, and the fact that he was more a Sadducee than a Pharisee. He kind of took after his father. He was not... he was a bit contrary to the way that Alexandra thought and how she would have set things up. So she didn't give him any power. She didn't give him any inheritance as far as political power goes. But he was, Aristobulus II was strong-willed, ambitious, very resentful of the fact that Alexandra had been put in charge of the country. Because these two guys, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, they were both grown up when their father died. The fact that he chose to leave the kingdom to Alexandra really rubbed Aristobulus the wrong way. He felt like he should be in charge, even though he was the second oldest. But he was a much more natural leader than Hyrcanus. He was confident, charismatic, but he could also be cruel and violent and unpredictable. So these are the two sons of Alexandra. And yeah, something that Aristobulus did even before the death of Alexandra, as Alexandra was allowing the Pharisees to sentence people to death, to search out and kill those who had taken part in their persecution specifically. Many of those men that were being hunted down had been distinguished military and political leaders, and some of them still had political office, and they were being taken and dragged away and executed. And Aristobulus spoke out against this and convinced her to allow most of the noble and wealthy Sadducees to flee Jerusalem and live in the fortresses of Israel. And what he said, quote from Josephus here, Aristobulus told her, the case is this, that they have been themselves the authors of their own calamities, who have permitted a woman, who against reason was mad with ambition, to reign over them, when there were some in the flower of their age fitter for it. In other words, you're an old woman, and if you had any decency, you'd step down and let me be king. You don't deserve this position. And he got away with a lot. People knew what Aristobulus's opinions were, but Alexandra reluctantly agreed to give all but 3 of Israel's fortresses to the Sadducees. That's where he sent them. And the result was that most of the defensible positions throughout the country were occupied by men who were very unhappy with the current political situation and very loyal to Aristobulus. They knew that they owed him their lives. So you can kind of tell how this is going. So in time, Alexandra fell ill, and Aristobulus, son number 2, traveled away by night to one of those strongholds. And with the help of the Sadducees, whose lives he had saved, he began to take over the strongholds one by one, take control of them, which wasn't hard because they were basically already occupied by his people. And in response, the leaders of Jerusalem, Aristobulus hadn't taken his wife and kids with him when he snuck away. The leaders of Jerusalem arrested his wife and children to use as leverage. And then they and Hyrcanus went to the queen to hear her decision about what was to be done. And she reminded them that they still had control of the capital, they had control of the standing army, the official army of Israel, and the kingdom's treasury. But she left the decision of what to do up to them. She said she didn't have any interest anymore in all of that. She knew that she was going to die. And she did die in 67 BC, so 67 years BC, leaving behind a deeply divided family and nation. So, then we have the 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And this is from the Jewish War. I'm just going to read what Josephus says for a little bit here. Now Hyrcanus was the rightful heir to the kingdom, and his mother had committed it to him before she died. But Aristobulus was greater than him in both power and personality. Near Jericho, they came to battle to decide who would have the kingdom. But most of the men with Hyrcanus deserted him and went over to Aristobulus. Hyrcanus, with those of his followers who stayed loyal, fled back to the fortress in Jerusalem, where Aristobulus's wife and children were being held as hostages. So Aristobulus had the political power, but his wife and children were in the power of Hyrcanus. So it's a situation that could have turned extremely ugly if Hyrcanus himself was a more ambitious and cruel person. But he wasn't. And honestly, he didn't care that much, not nearly as much as Aristobulus did, about the kingdom. So they made peace with each other before things could come to extremes. They agreed that Aristobulus should be king, but that Hyrcanus should keep his income and all of his privileges as the king's brother. So they were reconciled to each other in the temple and embraced one another in a very kind manner, while the people stood about them. From that time on, Aristobulus lived in the royal palace, and Hyrcanus lived in the house that used to belong to Aristobulus. Okay, so they just kind of switched places like that. And it should have ended right there. That's kind of a nice ending to the conflict. Hyrcanus had no appetite for politics. He adjusted rather well to his early retirement. But there was someone else just as ambitious and crafty as Aristobulus, and he was not content with the current situation. So, remember the Idumeans. The Idumeans are the Edomites. After Israel was taken into captivity, the Edomites moved into southern Israel, took it over, and became the Idumeans. No, they've come back. So this is, yeah, these guys are both Jews. What's that? Yep. Yep. So the kingdom of Israel was reestablished. They were independent for a while, actually, before the coming of Christ. They were under the power of Persia, first of all. Then they came under the power of Greece and the Seleucid Empire. And then, yeah, for a while, they won their independence. It was a great thing. Now they are a private kingdom for now, but that is about to change. So the Idumeans, the Edomites, they had been conquered by Israel. They had been forced to convert to Judaism. And there was one Idumean, the governor of Idumea. And Josephus says there was a certain friend of Hyrcanus, an Idumean, called Antipater. So remember that name, Antipater. He is just being introduced now, but he is one of the most important people in this story. King Alexander had given Antipater leadership of Idumea. He had made him general of all Idumea. And Antipater was very rich and was by nature a man of action and sedition. So he was cunning and had a good knack for taking action at the right time. He was a combination of crafty and courageous, which is a very powerful, dangerous combination in a politician. And he was very much a politician. So Hyrcanus has lost power, but Antipater, as Hyrcanus's friend and ally, is not happy. He wants Hyrcanus to get the power back so that he can have more power himself. So Antipater worked secretly to stir up the Jewish nobles against Aristobulus to try to get people on his side. And he also tried to convince Hyrcanus that his brother Aristobulus was eventually going to kill him, that it wasn't safe for Hyrcanus to stay in Jerusalem. And at first, Hyrcanus refused to believe this, but Antipater was so persistent that he at last persuaded Hyrcanus to flee Jerusalem and travel with him, with Antipater, to Petra in Nabatea. Okay, so here's how it is. The Edomites left Edom and settled in southern Israel. The place that used to be Edom is now Nabatea. It was settled by Arabs who called themselves the Nabateans, and their capital was Petra. So this is where Hyrcanus and Antipater fled. And you may recognize this. You've seen it before if you've watched the Indiana Jones movies. This is where the climax of the Last Crusade was filmed. So Nabatea was an Arab country in what used to be Edom, and the Nabateans are the people who built Petra. So, bit of a spoiler alert so you can kind of keep track of him better and understand his importance better. Antipater is Herod's dad. Herod the Great's father is Antipater, the governor of Idumea. And Herod himself was an Idumean, an Edomite. So, Hyrcanus didn't want power, but Antipater wanted him in power. Hyrcanus was weak and easily influenced, which is why Aristobulus felt justified in taking the kingdom away from him in the first place. But Antipater knew that if he could put Hyrcanus back on the throne, that he, Antipater, would be the real power in Israel. So, Antipater happened to be close friends with Aretas, king of the Nabateans. So Antipater and Aretas talked, and Antipater convinced him to support Hyrcanus in exchange for 12 Nabatean cities that Alexander had captured before. So Israel had control of some cities that used to belong to the Nabateans. Antipater said, you can have those back if you support us, if you give us an army, so that we can go back to Israel and overthrow Aristobulus. So Aretas, the king of the Nabateans, invaded Israel with an army of 50,000 and defeated Aristobulus in battle. Aristobulus and the few who remained loyal to him, mainly the priests, fled to Jerusalem and barricaded themselves inside the temple. So the priests, mostly at this time, were Sadducees. So they were on Aristobulus's side, and they made the temple their fortress. And this happened around the time of the Passover. And because of the siege, because they were cut off from the rest of the city and the rest of the people, the priests in the temple were unable to offer the required sacrifices for Passover, which was a big deal to them. It was a big deal for the nation that they couldn't celebrate the Passover properly because of this. And so, because of this, they called down to their enemies outside the temple, asking them to sell them cattle to sacrifice. And their fellow Jews agreed, but they set a very, very high price for those animals. And the priests lowered the money down from the temple walls, but then the promised animals were never delivered. So it was just an opportunity that the non-priests used to get money for themselves out of the temple. And those sacrifices ended up not being made that year. And so the priests prayed to God for vengeance, and shortly afterwards a strong windstorm destroyed many of the crops throughout Israel. And those events were connected in a lot of people's minds. This is something that happened right at this time that Josephus also records for us. Now there was a man whose name was Onias. He was a righteous man and beloved of God. Once, during a certain drought, he had prayed to God to put an end to the intense heat, and God had answered his prayer and sent them rain. So he has a reputation as being a very righteous man, somebody that God pays attention to. So Onias had gone into hiding because he saw that this rebellion would last a great while. However, they found him and brought him to the Jewish camp. They hoped that just as he had once put an end to the drought by his prayers, he would be able to bring down a curse on Aristobulus and those who followed him. So, kind of like the king of Moab calling Balaam, like, hey, curse my enemies for me, because God hears you. And Onias refused. He wouldn't do it. He argued with them. But the multitude continued to insist that he speak. So Onias stood up in the midst of them and said, O God, the King of the whole world, since those that stand here with me are your people, and those that are besieged are also your priests, I beseech you that you will neither listen to the prayers of the priests against these men, nor bring into effect what these pray against the priests. As soon as he had made this prayer, the wicked Jews that stood about him stoned him to death. So a lot of unpleasantness that happened around this time. And stepping north a little bit and out of this situation, leaving it as it is for a little while. In 64 BC, the great Roman general Pompey, that's his picture right there, that is Pompey. He sent his tribune, Emilius, Marcus Aurelius, of course, is a name that gets stuck in your head, but Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, to take Damascus from the Seleucids, and I'm just going to call him Scaurus. So Pompey sent Scaurus to take Damascus, okay, the capital of Syria. At that time, it belonged to the Seleucids. It was the Seleucid Empire had been getting smaller and smaller and smaller until Syria is all they had left. And they were under attack at that time by Rome. Rome was interceding in a civil war. And the Seleucid Empire, their line of kings ended at that time. But yeah, it was never quite as simple as Rome just coming through and conquering, usually. There was always something that triggered that conflict. But yeah, so they're fighting a war in Syria. And Scaurus is sent to Damascus to take it. When he arrived, Scaurus found Damascus was already under Roman control. There was a little loss of lack of coordination there between the generals. So when he heard about the civil war going on in Judea, he thought, I'll go down south and I'll intervene there. So as soon as Scaurus entered Judea, it's not like they were upset to have him there. They were actually both very, very eager to get his help. Both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus sent messages to Scaurus offering him 400 talents if he supported their side in the war. So Scaurus decided he didn't really pay any attention to the rights and wrongs of the situation. He just figured it was easier to defeat an invading army, than it was to besiege and take a city. So he decided to side with Aristobulus and rescue those who were besieged, which he did. He broke the siege at Jerusalem. He ordered King Aretas from the Nabateans to return to his own country. And not wanting to make an enemy of Rome, wisely, Aretas and Hyrcanus, Antipater, that whole group, agreed to retreat. However, while they were retreating, Aristobulus pursued them and attacked them unexpectedly, killing about 6,000 of them, including Antipater's brother, Phaleon. So he poured salt on the wound, made sure the conflict would continue on. And Antipater was the brains behind everything that Hyrcanus's group did. Antipater knew that it wasn't worth bothering with Scaurus very much. Scaurus didn't really have the power. The power was in the hands of Pompey, the great general. He was one of the three most powerful people in the Roman Empire, actually. Sorry. I'm going to accidentally call it the Roman Empire sometimes. It's not an empire. It's a republic at this time. But he was one of the three most powerful Romans. And so the following year, Pompey himself marched south into Syria, finally put an end to the Seleucid kingdom, won the war up there. So the Seleucids, we're not going to hear anything more about them. They're gone. But while he was staying in Damascus, Pompey was met by three delegations of Jews. Three groups of Jews came up to him. And the first group included Hyrcanus, Antipater, and a large number of their supporters. And they accused Aristobulus of usurping the throne and asked Pompey to restore it to Hyrcanus. All very true. And the second group belonged to Aristobulus, who claimed that it had been necessary for him to depose his brother, since Hyrcanus was a weak-willed and incapable ruler, which honestly was also true. Aristobulus was another kind of bad ruler. But the third group of Jews was composed of those who were fed up with both brothers and wanted the nation to be governed by priests, with no king besides God himself. So each delegation made their case before Pompey and anxiously awaited his judgment, knowing that whatever Pompey decided, him being with the army that he had, in the position that he was, whatever he decided was going to be enforced. And Pompey respected the humility of Hyrcanus, actually. He liked Hyrcanus, thought he was a good guy. Felt rather differently about Aristobulus. Aristobulus was violent and proud and just did not make a good impression at all. So Aristobulus knew pretty early on things weren't going his way with Pompey. But Pompey ordered both brothers to wait until he had dealt with the Nabateans. He was going to fight them first, and after that he would come to Judea and settle their dispute. But since he knew that things were kind of turning against him, he wasn't going to get his way, Aristobulus did not wait for Pompey's decision. He left, ran back to Jerusalem, and started solidifying his position as king, to reassert himself as Israel's king. And of course that did not please Pompey, and any part of him that might have been considering choosing Aristobulus, that was snuffed out, that whole possibility. So Pompey took Hyrcanus's side and marched against Jerusalem. He pursued Aristobulus with his whole army. And when Aristobulus realized the hopelessness of his situation, he realized he could not defeat Rome. So he went out, he had a change of heart. He went out to Pompey and surrendered. He promised to deliver the city and a large sum of money into Pompey's hand. So Aristobulus and his people are in Jerusalem. Aristobulus leaves and surrenders to Pompey. So Pompey sends men to Jerusalem to accept the surrender and the stuff that Aristobulus has promised. Aristobulus's followers in Jerusalem won't let them in. They refuse. They haven't surrendered, even if their leader has. So they wouldn't let them in or deliver the money. And at this, Pompey had Aristobulus arrested and laid siege to Jerusalem. And we might look next week at more of the details of how this siege played out. But for now, in the words of Josephus, when the battering engine was brought near, the greatest of the towers was shaken by it and fell, breaking down a part of the fortifications, so that the enemy poured in quickly. This is after they had been besieging the city for a while. Then there was a great slaughter, some of the Jews being slain by the Romans, and some by one another. There were even some who threw themselves down precipices or set fire to their own houses, since they were not able to bear the miseries they were under. 12,000 of the Jews fell, but of the Romans very few. And no small crimes were committed against the temple itself, which in former ages had been inaccessible and seen by none. For Pompey went into it. Pompey went into the Jewish temple, along with many of those who were with him, and saw everything which it was unlawful for any men but the high priests to see. There were in that temple the golden table, the holy candlesticks, the pouring vessels, and a great quantity of spices. So it's interesting that Josephus doesn't mention here at this time in history that the Ark of the Covenant was there. Apparently it wasn't. But he says, besides these, there were among the treasures 2,000 talents of sacred money. But at this point, Pompey acted in a manner worthy of his virtue, and he touched none of these things because of his respect for religion. So even though he was insensitive to Jewish sensibilities, didn't realize probably how bad they would take it, he did go into the temple himself. He didn't take anything out of it. He was probably the only person in the history of Jerusalem and all of the times it's been besieged and taken, not to raid the temple. He did have respect for religion. And the next day he ordered those who had charge of the temple to cleanse it and to bring whatever offerings the law required to God. He also restored the high priesthood to Hyrcanus, both because he had been useful to him in other respects and because he hindered the Jews in the country from giving Aristobulus any assistance in the war. So Hyrcanus is the high priest again. Everything is good, sort of, except things are a little bit different now. Pompey gave him the priesthood back, but no longer allowed him to be called king. So he did bend to the wishes of that third group a little bit too. Said, you're not going to have kings anymore. He didn't leave them independent, though, which is really what they wanted. Instead, he declared Judea a client kingdom under the authority of Syria. So Syria, which they had just taken over, that's now ruled by a Roman governor. And he said, okay, the Roman governor in Syria has control now of Judea as well. That's part of his domain. So obey him, do what he says. So, and when we read the New Testament, we sometimes see the Romans as little more than cruel oppressors, kind of like the evil empire in Star Wars. But how do you feel like the Romans saw themselves? Very, very much. Exactly like we do.
It was good.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, when I was just saying, I've been thinking about a lot of things you're saying, but my mind's someplace else. The thing is that if they would just had, you know, when they took Jesus, we have no other king but Caesar. If they had just gone back and said, we have no other king except God, the Father,
Mm-hmm.
this stuff might have been not going on, you know? It's all because we are sin. We
Yeah.
decided to go where we wanted to do, and you're paying the price for sin.
Yeah.
But eventually, he wins out. He's already won. That's the thing. God has already won.
Absolutely. So yeah, from a Jewish perspective, the Romans were terrible people. They were lawless Gentiles like all other Gentiles. But from the Roman perspective, they were doing a really good thing here. From Pompey's own perspective, he was coming in, bringing peace, bringing order to a country that couldn't keep itself together.
And how they acted. What did Paul do? He appealed to Caesar, and
Mm-hmm.
he's taking a Roman citizen.
Yeah,
So
it was a big deal.
Romans were just, I mean, yeah, they were savage in the way they carried out their punishment, but you didn't do a lot of stuff against Rome either.
Yeah.
But if you were a Roman citizen, you had a lot of perks.
Mm-hmm.
You had the ability to go before Caesar and have your case heard.
Yeah. Yeah, they did a lot of things in a way that would be very appealing to us today. And things were a little bit different at that point because they were an empire, and at this point still a republic, but a lot of the same values in that society. And it does, I don't want to make it political, I mean, because people in both camps in our country have done this exact same thing, but this is how we act in foreign affairs typically. I mean, if somebody is being persecuted or injustice is being done, we feel it is our responsibility to step in to help those poor, lesser countries develop a better system of government that we approve of, and we kind of stay there and help enforce things. So yeah, the mindset that the Romans had was very, very modern American in a lot of ways. And we shouldn't judge them too harshly. From their own perspective, as I said, they were doing a lot of good. And Josephus, I mean, of course, he wrote to a Roman audience, so he's not going to say anything too critical of Rome, but he puts the responsibility entirely on Hyrcanus and Aristobulus for this happening. He sees it as a tragedy, the loss of Israel's independence. But he says, now the causes of this misery which came upon Jerusalem were Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, by raising rebellions against one another. For now we lost our liberty and became subject to the Romans. We were deprived of the land with which we had gained, the land which we had gained by our arms from Syria, and were compelled to return it to the Syrians. In just a short time, the Romans exacted from us over 10,000 talents in taxes. And the royal authority, which was a dignity that had been bestowed on high priests by the right of their family, became the property of private men. So a lot changed. We still aren't quite to the Israel we see in the New Testament yet. There's more that needs to change before it gets to that point. Israel is still kind of sort of independent. They're a client kingdom. When we get to the New Testament, at least the ministry of Jesus, they are a Roman province under the direct control of a Roman governor. And we'll see how that happened as well. But the only person who this really worked out for was Antipater. And he got pretty much what he wanted, the kind of power he was looking for. And we're going to see the results of that as well as we move on. Any questions before we close today?
I was wondering, the images you have of like the coins, faces,
Uh-huh.
those,
No, no, somebody in the 1500s, I believe, illustrated those. Yeah. Yeah. Now, like the bust of Pompeii, that was carved by somebody who actually saw the guy. So we do have, for the Romans, we typically do have um, at least reasonably realistic representations of what they looked like. The Jews didn't make pictures in that way because of the commandments. They were very hesitant
okay.
making graven images or anything like that. Yeah, so yeah, we don't have a lot of Jewish pictures, Jewish artwork that we can unearth. But so yeah, we pretty much have to rely on what other nations around them did in that regard. All right, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father, thank you for just how in control you are again, and the way that you work out your plan, even when it looks horrible from our perspective, even when it looks like sheer chaos. And help us to remember that you always do have a plan, that you're always in perfect control. And help us to be aware of our attitudes and actions that just kill in us any shred of personal ambition that we may have, a desire to put ourselves first before others, to put ourselves in positions of authority or influence, not for any other reason but that we think we are more important than other people. We see in some of these people just our own sins magnified. Please bless this morning. Bless us as we read your word and study it and praise you, that our hearts be sincere and right before you in everything we do and throughout this coming week. In Jesus' name, amen.